There is so much we don't know about William Shakespeare. We're not sure exactly what he looked like, though this portrait may be the most definitive, at least as of 2009, and he himself spelled his name in many different ways. Let's do a little investigation of William Shakespeare, the man. This won't be an exhaustive history of the fellow, just a few highlights that I find to be particularly noteworthy or entertaining about his life. Let's start with the date, April 23rd. As you can see, he was born on April 23rd and died on April 23rd. Well, the fact is that while we know he was definitely born in 1564, we don't know if he was actually born on April 23rd. We do know that he was christened on April 26th because that's what was recorded in the church registry. The practice at this time was for parents to take their newborns to be christened within 2 to 3 days after their birth, so scholars have found it convenient to say that Shakespeare was born on April 23rd. We know for a fact that he died on April 23rd, 1616, at the age of 52, which is actually quite young for that time. This is the house where Shakespeare was born in Stratford-on-Avon in England. The Avon is a river that runs through Warwickshire. You can see that it's a good-sized house. It's kind of elegant. The Shakespeares were solidly middle class. Here's a map of the area. Here is Stratford-on-Avon, and here is the area where Shakespeare's grandfather and mother grew up. Shakespeare's mother, Mary Arden, was from a wealthy farm family. The family goes back for centuries in this area. The Forest of Arden, a pretty sizable forested tract of land, bears their name. So Mary was a good marriage partner for John Shakespeare, who was a glover and a herdsman. A glover is a craftsman who makes gloves. Most glovers also kept their own animals, sheep, pigs, goats, that they would eventually skin and make their gloves out of. I think sometimes people are a little confused at the idea that John was a herdsman and a glover. It doesn't sound like a particularly glamorous life or very auspicious beginnings for one of the greatest writers of the English language. It may not have been. But these gloves were something special. Here's an example of the kind of glove that Shakespeare's father would have been making. You can see that they're pretty elaborate and quite lovely. Shakespeare's father would have sold his gloves all over England. In addition to being a glover, John was periodically the mayor of Stratford, so the Shakespeares were a socially prominent family. John could read a little, but he didn't seem to be able to write very well. He only signed his name with a mark. Mary was probably completely illiterate. She could neither read nor write. Young Will, on the other hand, was educated at the Stratford Grammar School. This was a good school, with a good schoolmaster as well, and Shakespeare would have been very well taught. Let's take a look at the map again, because I want to point out to you an area right near Stratford, Shottery. This is where Anne Hathaway was born in 1556. Why, you might ask, is that important? Well, this is the woman whom Shakespeare married. Let's take a look at some interesting things about her. Anne and Will were married in 1582 when he was 18 years old. That's very young even at that time for someone to get married. Men usually married in their mid to late 20s. At 18, Shakespeare hadn't even reached the age of majority yet. Anne, on the other hand, was 26 years old, considerably older than he was. In the 16th century, the norm was for a woman to be a couple years younger than her husband. For a boy of 18, a 26-year-old woman is old for a wife. To complicate matters, she was already pregnant. That's kind of an interesting point. Although births to unmarried women were not necessarily as frowned on at this time as they became in, say, the Victorian era, the ideal woman was supposed to be chaste, supposed to be modest. So, Anne was already pregnant when she and Will married. In fact, she gave birth to their daughter Susanna 6 months later. There are some questionable things about the wedding with Anne Hathaway. The first thing is the banns. For centuries, when two people wanted to get married, they would go to the church clerk and register to get a marriage license. To do this, they would request that the banns be said. This is how the banns worked. For 3 Sundays, the priest would stand up in front of the congregation and say, "These folks want to get married. Does anyone see an impediment to that?" An impediment might be that one or the other of them was already engaged to be married to somebody else. Or it might be that one of them was already married, or that the man was contracted as an apprentice, and the contract said that he wasn't allowed to get married until the apprenticeship was over. Essentially, the banns were a way of advertising the upcoming wedding to a population who mostly couldn't read, and making sure that no legal complications existed. So the banns were read 3 times, then on week 4, the couple married. Interestingly, Anne and William did not have the banns said. Instead, 2 farmer friends of Anne's deceased father put up a bond, or a sum of money, in order to bypass the banns. Essentially, they said, "We are committing this sum of money to assure the church and the law that there are no impediments. We are so sure that there are no impediments here that we're willing to put up £40. £40 at this time was a huge amount of money. For example, it was twice the amount of money that the schoolmaster earned per year. So there are many scholars who believe that these farmer friends of Anne's deceased father forced Shakespeare into marrying her quickly to save her from the embarrassment of showing that she was pregnant at the wedding. After all, young women were supposed to be chaste, remember? To complicate the history even more, there is the matter of Anne Whateley. Who was she? The day before Anne Hathaway and Will went into the church and applied for a license, William Shakespeare and Anne Whateley are recorded requesting a marriage license for themselves. Many scholars believe that William Shakespeare actually wanted to marry this other young woman, Anne Whateley, who lived nearby. But the farmer friends forced him to marry Anne Hathaway, whom he had gotten pregnant, instead. But there's another group of scholars who believe that the church clerk who was recording these requests got a little confused. Maybe he was pressured for time. There were a lot of people in line, whatever it might be. In the record book, 2 or 3 lines above the notation about Anne Whateley and Will Shakespeare, there is a record of another Whateley making a different request. It's possible that the clerk simply wrote in the wrong Anne. They suggest that the next day, Anne Hathaway and William Shakespeare came back in to correct the error. It's possible. Although there's no real way to know exactly what happened, we do know for a fact that Shakespeare was there for his daughter Susanna's birth, and 2 years later, the twins, Hamnet and Judith, were born. However, sometime between the wedding and 1592, Shakespeare left Stratford and traveled to London, and he very rarely came back. Not only that, we have no records of him ever writing a letter to his wife or his children. Nothing. Of course, Anne was probably illiterate, as many women of her class were at that time, so if he did send letters, they would have to have been read by an educated neighbor or the town clerk. Why did Shakespeare leave? Well, there are several theories. The honest truth is, we just don't know. A popular theory for a long time was that he poached or illegally hunted deer on the land of the nobleman Sir Thomas Lucy, was caught, and had to leave to avoid punishment. There are some problems with that story, but it's a nice little romantic tale. An interesting theory is that the family was Catholic and never converted to the official Anglican religion, something Queen Elizabeth was making everyone do. In fact, she was sending spies around the country to secretly execute anybody who was still practicing the Catholic religion. If Shakespeare was suspected of being Catholic, maybe he had to run away. A current popular idea is that, as an educated man, he was hired to be a tutor for a nobleman's son, and while he was living on that estate, he saw some traveling theater companies which the nobleman invited to perform. He fell in love with theater, joined up with a company, and eventually went to London. Then, of course, there is the question of the marriage. Had he been forced into a marriage with a woman he didn't love, and eventually he just had to get out because he couldn't take it anymore? This brings us to a famous phrase, one which scholars point to as evidence of the Loveless marriage theory. In Shakespeare's will, he leaves everything he has to his daughter Susanna, except for a couple of trifles that he leaves to Judith. At this point, Hamnet is dead. He died when he was 11. Judith has gotten herself into a questionable marriage with a guy who seems a little slimy, and Shakespeare is trying to do what he can to keep any inheritance out of the husband's hands. But Susanna has married very well, and Shakespeare leaves almost everything to her. He does not mention his wife at all in his will, not one time, except for a little notation that's scribbled between the lines of the formal will. It was something added afterwards, after the whole thing had been written out, almost as an afterthought. In that jotting, he leaves his wife only his second best bed. That seems fairly telling. Even though we don't really know why Shakespeare left Stratford-on-Avon or even exactly when, we do know for a fact that by 1592 he was established in London as a playwright. We know that thanks to Robert Greene, who was also a playwright, and who seems to be a little annoyed that Shakespeare, the upstart crow, has done so well. In a commentary from 1592, he refers to a shake scene, and he makes an allusion to one of Shakespeare's famous lines from an earlier play. So we know that Shakespeare is in London and beginning to be a famous playwright by 1592.